I'm going to try not to spend the whole class on fairy stories. Try being the very operative word. We'll see what happens. I did put it on D2L, right?
You did.
Okay. I just there for a moment thought I did. Oh, yeah. Anybody else come in and didn't get it? So, we're going to skip everything but the third question that Tolkien deals with. Because that's where he really gets at the heart of what he wants to say. Okay? And the third question is, what are the uses and functions now of fairy stories? Okay. Notice, again, I think I kind of touched on this the other day, what that implies. It implies we use stories in some way, or stories serve a function. They serve a purpose that we need. Tolkien would argue that purpose or function, at the very least, is to kind of feed our soul. However you define soul, spirit, the human mind, whatever. Okay, but he goes on and talks about a bunch of other things. And in doing that, he addresses a particular issue, which I have not put up here, and that is children. Because we hear the word or the phrase fairy story, and we usually assume, oh, that's for kids. I mean, we have several courses offered in the department in children's literature. We have children's literature, we have adolescent literature. Sometimes it's called kiddie lit, which immediately tells you it's not serious, it's not important. I talked about the New York Times kind of stuff the other day with their book lists and such. Okay? Well, Tolkien addresses the quote-unquote problem of children in fairy stories, and essentially why he thinks children became associated with fairy stories predominantly in the 19th century. See, prior to the 19th century, 18th century, 17th century, 10th century, 5th century BC, stories weren't for children. Quote-unquote fairy stories weren't for children. They were for us. Why? Leaving Tolkien aside for a moment.
Because they're dark.
Okay, some are dark. Not all of them are dark.
They teach lessons.
They teach a lesson. Okay.
They're very whimsical a lot of the time and require a suspension of disbelief, which is easier when you're younger. That's
a term Tolkien is going to use because that suspension of disbelief idea. Stop shaking. It has a word in front of it, willful, and it comes, even though Hillary Clinton used it wrongly, it comes from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 19th century poet and literary critic, where Coleridge said that to read certain kinds of literature, you have to have a willful suspension of disbelief. Let's take literature aside, written literature aside for a moment, and let's think of visual literature, aka film. Okay? What must you do every time you step into a theater to watch any film in the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe?
You gotta believe.
You gotta believe. What do you gotta believe?
That whatever is happening is real.
Or, if not that it's real, it's possible. It's possible that Thor really might come down via the Bifrost here. You got to admit, you got to say it could happen in order to really get the full effect of the film. Okay? 1977, March specifically, a new film came out that was to change film history. And that's because the film began with words on the screen. And the words traveled from here to there and disappeared into the infinity a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Okay? Nobody had done that before. And then, so you had the words go from down here to up there, and then from up here to down there, you saw Star Cruiser enter. Not a Stanley Kubrick, brand spanking new, straight off the assembly line, sparkling white, but one with blast marks. Okay? It looks like the odometer has been reset on that sucker a few times, Okay? Well, what did you have to do there? You had to say, okay, notice how that one began. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. What is that merely a restating of?
Once upon a time.
Once upon a time. Every story that begins once upon a time tells you you have to go back into that story and try to enter that time frame, even if the time frame isn't stated. Okay? So, we've got to allow that to happen. What's the relation of that with children? Get back to the children. What do children have that most of, I'm not going to lay this on you, that I don't have anymore? Turned 58 last week, whatever. So, you said it, Esteban. Imagination. How so?
Like a lot of practical experience in the world at large.
Watch a 5-year-old by him or herself. Just watch them. Don't say anything, just watch. And man, they are living in another world. Go for a walk with a 5-year-old. Walk on a trail somewhere. Oh, look at this rock. Oh, look at this bottle cap. Put it down. You don't know where it's been. You don't know who's touched it. It can be covered with whatever. Okay? Everything is infused with wonder. And what else can you say to a 5-year-old much, much easier than you can to a 20-year-old, a 30-year-old, a 40-year-old, etc. You can tell them something and they'll do what?
They'll believe it.
They'll believe it. We use the term, they're so gullible. Gullible doesn't really apply to children. They are credible. That is, they easily believe. Why? They've not had enough experience to tell them, don't believe what anybody tells you. Everybody's out to screw you, which is kind of what our society later on comes to teach everybody. Okay? So Tolkien says, the reason fairy stories got associated with children is because sometime in the course of the 19th century, this idea gradually developed that fairy stories weren't important for us. Us meaning adults. Well, what else culturally, let's say, history of ideas, let's say, what else began slightly before the 19th century, 1800? What's that period known as? What's the 17th century? What's one of the 18th century? What's one of the nicknames of the 18th century?
Industrial Revolution.
Okay, the Industrial Revolution happens, but that's kind of an outgrowth.
Age of Enlightenment.
The Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Reason. Where reason, enlightenment, ideas, thought, that does away with what came before. Okay? There's an American historian, kind of a popular historian, who wrote a whole series of books called The Story of Civilization. And one of those books was titled The Age of Faith. It covered the history of the world, Western world, from essentially about 500 to 1000 or so AD. And then you had, the Renaissance, etc., and then the Age of Reason. Well, reason there counters faith. Faith is, I believe, click your heels 3 times, I believe. Reason is what? 2 plus 2 equals 4. If I can't see it, the way it gets transmuted in modern thought, if I can't see it, it's not real. If I can't evaluate it, it's not real. If I can't somehow quantify it, it becomes part of what's called in philosophy logical positivism. If it cannot positively be identified, be proven, it's not real. Okay? Doesn't mean not in a micro, it means if it can't be somehow witnessed and via the scientific method, reduplicated in terms of an experiment, it's not real. How real, therefore, is quote unquote love? According to the logic positivist, it's not. Love is what? Or our experience of love, we are now told, it's merely a result of a chemical reaction, an electrochemical reaction. Okay? Not to me, but whatever. Okay? So, Tolkien says, as a result, essentially, of these kinds of changes in thinking, fairy stories became, he uses the term relegated to children. The same way we relegate what to children. If we have children and we have furniture in our house, what kind of furniture usually gets put in, his term, the children's playroom? The stuff you don't want downstairs for the neighbors and visitors to come sit on. So you take the old worn out couch and you put it upstairs, and what do the kids do? They jump and bounce on it and they tear it up. Why? Because you don't care about it anymore. So he says, we gave these to children because we didn't care. Well, what movements in literature do we see in the 19th century? Realism, naturalism. That is, literature ought to show life as it really is. What's the end result of that? Mid-20th century novels. Helter Skelter, Catch-22, Catcher in the Rye. Which, any of you read any of those? Just describe their effect. How do they make you feel? Smiley? Happy? Life's wonderful and great? No, we have the phrase that we use in everyday reality. It's a catch-22 to imply what? You're screwed. No matter what. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Helter Skelter implies what? Chaos. Everything's going absolutely crazy. Okay? And that phrase, well, those are the logical results of kind of naturalism, realism, etc. But Age of Reason says we gotta face reality, and this is how we do it. We say life sucks. Bumper sticker. And then you die, It's not life's a beach, life's a bitch. And then you die, okay? Fairy stories don't say that, generally. They can, as Jocelyn suggested, they can be dark, right? What does Hansel and Gretel tell us? What does Little Red Riding Hood tell us?
Don't trust strangers.
Don't trust strangers. There are monsters out there. Are they wolves? I mean, do you really not walk between here and Cope and go through the Walnut Grove because there might be a wolf hiding? No. Can there be, quote unquote, wolves out there? It doesn't happen very often at MTSU or the local apartments and such nearby. But yeah, there are rapes that occur. Are those wolves? Hell yes. Wolves in human clothing.
Yeah, I think one of the big distinctions with Red Riding Hood is the fact that the wolf is trying to disguise himself as someone that you should trust.
Grandma.
Yeah, in that case.
Okay. Exactly. Okay. But one of the ideas in those stories that those stories are essentially teaching is what? Not everything is what it appears to be. Sometimes things that appear to be nice, they're not nice. And sometimes, as we'll see in The Lord of the Rings, things that don't appear to be nice are nice. The character of Strider, as we will see. Strider, bad casting in the film. Why? You could throw mud all over Viggo Mortensen and put him in a burlap sack, and he's still Viggo Mortensen. He's still gorgeous no matter what. It's like Chris Hemsworth. Make him ugly. How? Take a razor blade to his face, maybe, There's nothing else that's going to make him ugly.
Put a bag on his head.
Aragorn, however, isn't handsome. He's not supposed to be handsome. He's supposed to be fair on the inside and foul on the outside. Okay? Well, Tolkien's kind of, switching the ideas. Okay? So Tolkien essentially says fairy stories aren't meant for children. They weren't originally meant for children. How do we know? Because the fairy stories aren't merely the only stories, only the stories that we, for example, just been talking about. Hansel and Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, Snow White. The stories that are in Perrault's fairy stories, the stories that are in Grimm's fairy stories. Okay, and by the way, that adjective, Grimm, comes from the name of the brothers Grimm to describe those kinds of stories. Okay? What are the kinds of stories in history that you might be familiar with? You might have read portions of, at least of some of these, in high school English courses, are considered fairy stories.
Almost all like Greek mythology.
Greek mythology, a lot of it is fairy stories. Beowulf is a fairy story. Sir Gawain the Green Knight is a fairy story. Okay? An awful lot of those are fairy stories. Not because they involve fairies, but because they involve, as Tolkien will call it, this perilous realm. Okay? So he said, all right, so we're going to put aside children because they're not meant for children. They're meant for adults. So he says, if we're going to say they're meant for adults, how are they meant for adults? Let me find the exact quote that he uses. He says, no, that's children. Gets to the end of that. This is in my version here, which might be it's not going to be the same. The one that you guys downloaded because I couldn't find it in my office. This is on page 67. It's in the section on children, but it's getting towards the end. It's just before fantasy, where you have a little breakout fantasy. He says, very well then, if adults are to read fairy stories as a natural branch of literature, that is, like drama, or like tragedy and comedy and narrative poems and such, neither playing at being children nor pretending to be children, nor being boys who would not grow up, what are the values and functions of this kind? And when he makes the comment about, being boys who would not grow up, a couple paragraphs earlier he referred to Peter Pan. Why? Who's Peter Pan?
He's a boy that never grew up.
A boy that never grew up. Why didn't he grow up? Somebody said it. He didn't want to. Why doesn't he want to grow up?
He doesn't want to face the responsibility.
Why does one part of me really want to go back to 1965 when I was only 3 years old?
It'd be a lot more fun.
Easier to deal with reality because I didn't have reality to deal with. Okay? He doesn't want to face reality. Why is he the leader of the Lost Boys? Why are they lost? It's not only because they're in Neverland. They're all abandoned or lost, literally, but they also don't want to grow up. They're lost in the sense they have no direction. They have no destination. So Tolkien, when he talks about Peter Pan at the top of that page, he says children are meant to grow up and not to become Peter Pans, right? What's the whole purpose of when a baby is born? Grow. No parent wants to bury their child. They want that child to outlast them, okay? Not to lose innocence and wonder. He's talking about children. Children aren't supposed to lose innocence and wonder. No. He says, but to proceed on the appointed journey. What's the appointed journey? Life. Adolescence, adulthood, etc. Ultimately, death. Okay? You start dying the moment you take your first breath. Sounds morbid, but it's true. So, he says, that journey, the appointed journey, that journey upon which it is certainly not better to travel, hopefully, than to arrive, but we must travel, hopefully, if we are to arrive. Now, this is part of Tolkien's Catholic consciousness coming in. If you're not aware that Tolkien's Catholic, you need to be aware Tolkien is Catholic. In one of his letters, written after The Lord of the Rings was published, he said, the Lord of the Rings kind of began in one way. He said, But it is fundamentally a Catholic and philosophical work, much more so in the revising than in the writing. That is, he didn't set out to write a Catholic work, but as he just tinkered with it over 17 years, that Catholicism just kind of naturally entered. And we'll talk about elements of that. Okay? So, he says the destination of the journey is what's important. Now, for a Catholic, what's that going to be? Heaven. Here, it's, let's channel Led Zeppelin. It's the stairway to heaven. Okay? But he says you have to have hope to take that journey. Why? Because if all you read is Catcher in the Rye, how much hope do you have?
You're going to give up.
Yeah, kill me now. But it's one of the lessons of fairy stories, if we can speak of the lessons of things that do not lecture. Fairy stories don't lecture. Horace, first century Roman poet, said the purpose of literature is twofold: to teach and delight. It's to teach. There's a message being conveyed, and to delight. What happens when all you have is teach? Sermons. You get bored. And my specialty is Old and Middle English. There's a hell of a lot of Middle English literature that was only written to teach. They didn't get this part of the memo. And it's boring as all get out. There's this one thing written by this guy named Orm, O-R-M, called the Ormulum. Little conceited, I guess, And it's, if I remember right, it's 30,000 lines. Beowulf is 3,100. It's 30,000 lines of didactic teaching message. There's no pleasure. None at all. Okay? There's an awful lot of stuff like that in the Middle Ages. So, he says, fairy stories don't have as their purpose lecturing. Okay? Their purpose ultimately is pleasure, but this is buried. So, he says it's one of the lessons of fairy stories that on callow, lumpish, and selfish youth. What's it mean to be callow?
Basically uncaring, kind of callous.
Uncaring, calloused. Kind of hard on the outside. Lumpish, not fully formed. Right? Because when you're 12 years old, you're not fully formed. I mean, psychologists tell us the male brain, ladies, you're lucky, the male brain isn't fully formed until about the age 25, 26. Which is maybe why we should cut guys a little bit, in my opinion, a little bit of slack when they do stupid, notice the emphasis, things when they're 16, 18, 20. Doesn't mean you let them off, okay? Especially if it's really bad. But that on callow, lumpish, and selfish youth, what? Peril, sorrow, and the shadow of death can bestow dignity, and maybe even sometimes wisdom. All right? Wisdom, dignity. What's Tolkien saying there? Well, he's implying fairy stories do what? Fairy stories involve peril. You might die in the story. Sorrow. And maybe even death. I argue, as you will see, when we get to the second half. Well, it's not the second half. It's like the second 3/4 of the course, because Lord of the Rings only takes up about a quarter. I will argue, really when we get to the last book, I won't say much in the first few books. The Harry Potter stories, they're ultimately about one thing, one key main idea. How to die well. They're about preparing us to die. They're about preparing Harry to die. Why? Because we're going to find out in book 7. It's the only reason he's still alive. He's been raised as a lamb for the slaughter. Okay? But it's teaching him. 1, you got to die. Everybody has to die. 2, there's no escaping death. 3, it all depends on how you face death. You can face death running and screaming away from it, or same kind of thing. Dragged kicking and screaming to it. Or you can face death with your head held high, chest out, and go, come on, bring it on. I'm not going to cower, etc. Okay? That's kind of the idea Tolkien is talking about there. So, that's when he goes on and says, if fairy story is a kind is worth reading, it's worth being written for and by adults. Now go back to adults, where he said the thing, if adults are to read them, it's a natural branch of literature, etc. When I was working on my PhD, had a doctor's appointment. My wife was pregnant. We'd found out a couple months earlier. My wife was pregnant, and I'd had a doctor's appointment at the campus clinic. And I'd started reading Winnie the Pooh. Hadn't read Winnie the Pooh in 25 years, probably. I was 30, 31 at the time. And so I'm, in the waiting room, and then I get called back to the room, and I've got this hardback, and I'm reading it because I want to refamiliarize myself with Winnie the Pooh, because I'm thinking when our daughter's born, we didn't know it was a daughter then, but when our child was born, as a baby, I'm going to start reading because I know all the science that says, how important reading is and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm sitting there, I'm reading Winnie the Pooh, and the doctor comes in, and she kind of snickers and goes, you're reading Winnie the Pooh. And I immediately, blinders and walls go up, I get defensive because here I am, I'm a 30-year-old man, no, I take that back, not even that old, 28-year-old, man, macho, it's because my wife's pregnant. I'm also reading it because I like Winnie the Pooh. Winnie the Pooh's brilliant. Pooh is brilliant. He's one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. Okay. Anyways, I do exactly what Tolkien says we shouldn't do. Okay. Pretending to be, boys who would, etc. So he says, if written with art, and by that he means technical brilliance, if it's good, they have the prime value of fairy stories will simply be that value which as literature they share with other literary forms. He never states what that value is. That is, why do we read literature? What is its purpose? I tried that question in my first class, which is Introduction to Literature, the experience of literature, and, just glazed stares, silence, If you are a reader, why do you read?
To expand.
How do you mean? You read literally? To mentally expand. How do you mentally expand? What do you read?
I read novels about adventure.
Okay, adventure novels. Real adventure, that is factual stuff, or fiction? Okay, both. So, if you're reading factual stuff, you're learning about things in the real world. If you read fiction, how are you learning there?
Well, you're learning experiences and feelings and human, how people connect to each other.
Exactly.
How they connect to each other in books is the exact same way that people connect to each other.
Relationships.
Yeah, relationships.
We all exist in relationship. We might not want to. I'm a loner. I'm antisocial. I don't like big groups. My department has parties every beginning of the year. I went to one my first year, 28 years ago. I have not been to one since. Okay, one-on-one, very small groups, I'm fine. I don't like big gatherings. That's why you'll never see me, at a concert, a big concert with 20,000. Okay. Literature gives us what? It gives us an experience that isn't our own. Yes?
Well, it also makes you think, you were talking about Harry and how he was preparing for death. If I'm reading that, then I'm also thinking to myself, wow, if this were me, how would I respond?
Bingo! As Aristotle kind of puts it, I'm going to modify a little bit what he says. In his book on poetics, talking about Greek drama, Greek tragedy, it kind of gives you there, but for the grace of God go I. That is, we can live vicariously through that character. I don't have to suffer the same kinds of things Oedipus suffers. If I can learn from Oedipus George Santayana, early 20th century philosopher, said, those who don't learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. Need an example? 1919, 1939. We didn't learn from the stupid mistakes of the Great War, the war to end all wars, which was followed up by the Second Great War. Notice, World War II was never called the war to end all wars. I think humanity became a little bit smarter. And we kind of came to realize the nonsense that the 20th century began with, nonsense meaning the ideas, that it would be the progressive century, the Christian century, where we would reach, this nirvana state. We would reach an evolutionary goal of perfection. We would end war. We would end poverty. We would end hunger. By the end of Second World War, we realized what a bunch of freaking idiots we were to believe that nonsense. Well, what happened 6 years after the Second World War? It wasn't a war. It was a conflict. Korea. The Korean War wasn't strictly literally a war. People were killing and shooting each other, yes. But the United States never called it a war. We simply called it a police action, okay? Where tens of thousands of Americans died in a police action. And then we had Vietnam. Vietnam was a war. It was never a declared war. We had Grenada. We had Nicaragua. We had Gulf War I, Gulf War II. We have Afghanistan. I've got friends who served in Afghanistan. I've known people who died in Afghanistan. We're serving no purpose there any longer, okay? It just got to, churn out the meat, as it were. Tolkien's point here is literature does have a value, but he's not going to tell you what it is. You determine that as you read. Or maybe you're not a reader, but maybe you're a big film goer. Film is nothing but visual literature. Because what do you do with a film? You tell a story. That's what literature is.
Well, I also think what value you find in reading does change over time as well. Like, when you're younger, you might care more about, the more passionate stuff like adventures and all that. But as you get older, you might start read just for simple pleasures that don't involve anything crazy.
Yep. Or you might, read more to actually learn. My son, who's a law student, he used to read a lot of fantasy stuff. Now his reading isn't only boring law stuff, because he doesn't like reading that. When he, decides to read something, ask for something for a birthday or whatever, it tends to be more biography. He wants to read about significant individuals and how those individuals affected the time in which they lived. Because he has some grandiose ideas, what he wants to do and become, et cetera, okay? So Tolkien goes on, he says, fairy stories, in addition to that prime value, whatever that prime value is, they offer us, adults, he says, in a peculiar degree or mode. He doesn't define peculiar, degree, or mode. But fairy story / fantasy offers us these things: fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. And he says, and these are all things that we need more really than children do, right? Go back to that 5-year-old. The kid's living in Fantasy Island, in La La Land. Make, imaginary friends, the whole 9 yards, okay? So he says, all things of which children have as a rule less need than older people. Most of them are nowadays these 4 things. Most of these, he says, are now considered to be bad for anybody. Why? Because the Catcher in the Rye people will tell us, especially, this is always bad. You shouldn't try to escape reality. You need to face it head on. You need to say, my life sucks, and then go on. Okay? Tolkien's going to say, why? Why? Why not try to take a break? If it's a proper break, if it's a good, because what are some ways people do try to escape from reality?
Alcohol.
Suicide, alcohol, drugs, sex, games, gambling, you know, being online with your so-called social friends, you know. It's the exact opposite of what the word social means. Social media is anti-social media. Because what does it mean you're doing?
You're not paying attention to the people around you.
Okay, you're not, or you're not. This is social. This is social. There's nothing social about this. It's media, you bet. But it's not social. That's why I really think it's antisocial. It's a way of, stop that. It's a way of not really connecting. I mean, AT&T used to have a commercial back in the 70s. Reach out and touch someone. How were they suggesting you touch someone? That's not touching. This is touching, you know. This is touching. You can get dangerous there. We won't go there. Okay? So, he says these 4 things. And he starts with fantasy. And I'm not going to talk about everything that Tolkien says with fantasy because we'll never finish the class. But he does say fantasy has arresting strangeness. Long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. That was pretty arresting strangeness. Okay? Anybody know how he begins his first novel, The Hobbit? In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. What the hell is a hobbit? Because in 1937, people were going, huh? They had no idea what a hobbit was. You know that when Tolkien first wrote that sentence, he had no idea what a hobbit was. He was grading entrance exams to Oxford. One summer evening, he was in his study above his garage. Window was open, nice breeze was coming through, and he had a blue book. And he read the students, marked the student's essay, turned the page, and it was blank. And he just wrote, spur of the moment, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. And he was like, huh, and then put it aside. He had no idea what it meant. But he went back to it and was like, I got to figure out what that means. And he started creating a story. And he started telling the story to his 4 children as he wrote it. Okay? That then becomes 6 years later, The Hobbit, and he becomes internationally famous. Okay? So, fantasy, arresting strangers. He goes on to this long, and we're not going to talk about it, but he goes on to this long thing about how fantasy occurs. Okay? Every one of you are going to write 2 papers in here. I used to have more, but I got tired of grading. 2 papers, one on Tolkien, one on Rowling. Okay? And I'm going to give you a list of topics. You choose a topic, but then you will narrow that topic down to a thesis and stuff. But what will you have to do? You've got to come up with the idea. You've got to have the imagination. Where will that occur? Up here. Okay? Then what do you have to do? Cut the process, make it short. You got to write it, right? You get the idea for the paper, and then you have to write it. Okay?
You gotta make it sensible.
You gotta make it sensible. The sub-creation is your paper. Okay? What's it take to get from here to here? Art. Art. Some people might call that technique, writing ability, etc., etc. Tolkien calls it art. Okay? Now, I'll bet, maybe not most of you, but I'll bet many of you, when you come up with that idea, you're going to have it up here, and you're going to go, damn, this is a great idea. Sherman's going to love this. And I might, if I could do the Spock mind meld and go, oh, Libby, that's a beautiful, that's an A. Okay? But I might get somebody else and go, no, that's horrible. Leave now. That's an F, you know. Yeah. Be gone, wipe your mind clean, you know. Okay? Up here, we tend to think, but then what happens? Maybe not with you. Happened with me all the time. Lost in translation. Because up here, we're heaven. It's perfection. Down here, it's Catcher in the Rye. It's life sucks. Okay? And something doesn't quite come through. Well, Tolkien says, with real fantasy, with real fairy stories, if done with art, it does. Which is often why, I think at least, why he's considered the godfather, the grandfather, the father of modern fantasy literature. Other people wrote quote-unquote fantasy before him at the same time as he was writing. It just wasn't as good. And people have written an awful lot after him. My opinion, 90+% of it just isn't as good. For this simple reason. None of them are as fully realized and imagined and brought forth as Tolkien does in this. Here's an example. J.K. Rowling is a great storyteller. I would love to go camping and sit around a campfire, hand her a bottle of whiskey, and get her kind of lubed up in her mind and go. Tell me a story. Because, man, I bet she could tell some humdingers. I don't think Tolkien would be that good around a campfire. I really don't. Because I think he'd keep going back and going, no, let me rephrase that. That's not the right word. I need to pull out some old English word. Rowling would just get on a roll. And she wouldn't care if she made a mistake earlier on. Because that's what she does in the novels. The more farther along she goes, the more little errors kind of creep up because she violates the world she has created. She violates some of the laws of that world that she has created. Tolkien doesn't. That's why it took him 17 years before he published the first volume of this. Didn't take Rowling nearly that long. Okay? So, you got this idea of subcreation. He calls it subcreation because he says, again, his Catholic theology, none of us are God. God's the only one who creates. Ex nihilo, out of nothing. We all, if we are sub-creators, we create out of the stuff God has already given us. Like colors, light, trees, plants, animals, rocks, birds. Even if we're creating other worlds. All those things in those other worlds are made out of what?
Stuff we know.
Elements of this world. So we take elements of this world. We take a horse and an eagle. And what do we have? A hippogriff. Rowling didn't create that, by the way. It comes from the Middle Ages. Okay? This put them together. We take a man and a goat, or a man and a horse, and we have a centaur. Man and a goat, we have a satyr, or a faun, depending on when in Greek history you're thinking. Okay? So that kind of stuff. So fantasy, unreality, okay? Something really, really different. Okay? Think of the Harry Potter novels, how they begin. Is there anything arrestingly strange in the opening page? No, not really. But we start to see some weird stuff, and especially then when Harry goes to the London Zoo with the rest of the family, and he starts talking to the snake, and then the glass says, "We know we're not in Kansas anymore. Something's different there." Okay, so that's fantasy essentially. Recovery. Boy, we could spend a long time on this, because what does Tolkien mean by recovery? How does he put it? Regaining of a clear view, or seeing as we are meant to see. Well, why do we need a clear view? What does that obviously imply about all adults?
We're closed-minded.
We're closed-minded? So that implies not vision, but The mind is shut. What else?
I mean, we can end up being pretty callous, like we mentioned before.
We can be-
Like we, getting all that, catching the rhyness, sort of removed over time into to the right balance.
Okay. I mean, he talks about cleaning our lenses. Well, what are our lenses? Some of us have physical lenses.
It's like the way we see the world.
Bingo. Perfect. All of us are wearing lenses. And what he's suggesting is, it's one of the reasons I like teaching in this classroom is because of these wonderful windows here that have never been cleaned, I don't think, in the last 30 years. All of us are looking through lenses like that. Notice it's not crystal clear. Okay? So what's the dirt on our lenses? Our experiences, our baggage. Baggage isn't negative. It's not a pejorative term. What's meant by baggage? You go someplace and what do? You pack and you bring stuff with you. What are you packing and bringing with you? Those things that you need. Our baggage is that stuff that makes us who we are. It's your family. And some people go, no, it's not, not my family at least. Some of us, it's our economic background, our social background, our religious background. We have one. Harry Potter, for example, has no religious background. It's pretty clear in the course of the novel. Harry, religiously/spiritually speaking, is a blank slate. Even though he comes to discover he has a godfather. We'll talk about that. Yeah.
Whenever somebody describes the word baggage, I always think of it as more than negative.
Yeah, I know. And that's because it's often used that way. That's not what Tolkien implies. Tolkien implies it's just everything that makes us who we are. Now, maybe that is negative. I don't think that's meant that. For example, part of my baggage. I'm the youngest child of 5 kids. My brother, who's the middle, the third, he doesn't know what that's like, but I also don't know what it's like to be the unloved middle child. Like my 2 middle children, because I've got 4. I mean, they joke about it. Yeah, we're the unloved. Katie, who's the oldest, she's the most loved, and Seraphim, the youngest, he's the spoiled one. It's what my siblings say about me. Yeah, well, you're the spoiled one. I'm like, yeah, tell me about it. I mean, it's all of that. Educational background. Okay? Whether or not you went to a public school, whether or not you went to a private school, whether or not you went to a good public school, whether or not you went to a scary as all hell public school, or private school, because they're both also. All of that stuff that makes up who you are. Okay? So how does recovery apply to that? Let's go back to something we were talking about earlier in terms of the prime value. And I think Jocelyn mentioned it, about experience. We can't experience what somebody else's experience is unless we first try to do what? Take those lenses off. So I was saying this to my experience of lit class earlier, and I don't think it was sinking. I don't think they were getting it. Because part of what I was talking about is, it might mean we're going to read something by an author, or we're going to read something that discusses some material that you don't like. Because the author might use a word you don't like. N-word, for example, or something else. Well, that might cause some readers to immediately block it off. And what I try to get across is, you have to try not to. You have to try to enter into, 1, the mind of the author, and 2, the time frame. And say, okay, maybe from my 21st century perspective, this is, let's say sexist. But from a 5th century BC Greece perspective, there's no such thing as sexism. Even though, 21st century perspective, the fact that women were property in 5th century BC Athens had no say whatsoever. If I try to enter into the mind of the play Antigone, where we hear a woman not only speak up, but challenge and defy the king and say, you are wrong according to the laws of the gods. Okay? It helps a lot more if we try to enter her mentality and say, yeah, but I'm a nobody. Not only am I a nobody, I have no rights, I have no voice, and here I am challenging the king, who also happens to be her uncle. So she's not only going against the king, family, Sucks to be her. Okay? So that's part of recovery. So recovery means taking all that crap, as much as we can, positive and negative baggage, and doing what? Tolkien says, seeing as we are meant to see. And the specific example he gives is of family. Family. Why? Why not, other things? Trees.
You don't choose your family?
You don't choose your family. Boy, that's true, right? I bet some people here are going, yeah, because I could wish I had a different brother. I don't, by the way. So, why else? What do we tend to do with our family?
We're honest.
Louder?
We're honest.
Honest, okay. You're being conscious. What do we tend to, let me rephrase the question, unconsciously do to/with our family?
Take them for granted.
Bingo. Why do we take them for granted?
They've always been there.
Because they've always been there. And what do we assume? They will always be there. And then a September 11th happens. Or a Virginia Tech shooting. Or anywhere else shooting. And one day they're there and you haven't said, I love you to whomever. And the next day they're gone and you can never say. That's what Harry is dealing with all throughout the novel. We're going to see in the first novel, Harry's going to have a moment where he's going to look into a mirror. And what's he going to see? He's going to see himself in the mirror, but he's going to be surrounded by people. And he's going to look back. There's nobody back there. And he looks again, and the people are there. And now the people in the front are kind of looking particularly at, and he does this. So he's looking in the mirror. He does this because he still sees these people, but there's nobody back there that he feels. And the woman standing in the front starts to cry. As he's looking in the mirror. Why? Well, he comes to realize she sees me now. That is, when I do this, she knows I see her. And she cries. Why? It's his mother, who's been dead for 10 years. And she starts crying. And then the man who's standing next to her puts his arm around her. Showing us, in the context of the novel, that what is happening in that mirror is happening now. It's present tense. It's not, as Dumbledore will suggest, kind of merely happening in Harry's mind. This is not merely Harry projecting what the deepest desire of his heart is. Because how many of you want to see your parents cry? Never good. What's he seeing? He's seeing that his parents now realize he sees us. He knows it's us. Okay? And they wave at him. All right? Part of recovery, okay, is no longer taking family for granted. Why do we take them for granted? Because, as Camille suggested, we see them every day. He calls them our familiars. What does it mean when you're familiar with something? You know it, right? Every one of you. Peck Hall, as god-awful ugly as it is, as much as it is designed to kill your soul, okay? It's brutalist architecture, okay? It's like East Germany. I've been to parts of East Germany. I've been to, Czech Republic, and there's stuff there that's just horrible, okay? His point is, this idea of the familiar, I don't have a wedding ring because my fingers are always swollen. My wife and I will celebrate our 35th anniversary this year, okay? Tolkien's point is, unless I experience this, unless I attempt to practice that, what can I tend to do with my wife?
Ignore her. Be complacent.
Ignore her.
Don't respect her.
Don't respect her. I can treat her like my wallet. I don't mean literally stuff her in my pocket, but Because I'm familiar with her, because I've known her for 36 years, it's almost like I see an image of her, a photo, rather than the real her. And so when I interact, unless I'm paying attention, unless I am recovering like an addict, I tend to do what?
See what you want to say.
See what I want to see, or see what I think I see every day. Rather than seeing her, I'm one of those weird ones, okay, I'll admit it up front. Rather than see her the way I saw her when I literally first saw her and thought, I'm going to marry her. Stop that. My stomach. Okay? And in doing so, thinking, this is the most wonderful thing in the world. And, and then through the entire process of courtship and stuff before marriage. But, kind of like once the ring was on the finger, snap, the ball and chain went around the ankle. Okay? Why? Because as Tolkien puts the language, it's at that point you take possession. You own. And because you own it, you think you know it. Okay? Extrapolate then from familiars, from family, to everyday experience. How many of you walk into a classroom, any classroom, and you look at the classroom and you pay attention to how the classroom actually looks? You don't. Why? Because you see this stuff day in and day out. Well, it's concrete block. What's between the concrete block? You've got a level of mortar. What's the concrete block made of? If you go up and look at it carefully, you'll see little dimples, little holes. It's not perfectly smooth. What about the ceiling? You got ceiling tiles. They have little holes in them. You might get really bored and start counting the holes, I used to do that all the time in classes because I didn't have professors who changed their pitch and intonation and all that kind of stuff. Okay? Trees, they pretty much all look the same now, right? They're all dead. But Tolkien wants us to see a tree as if we've never seen a tree before. We can't physically, literally do that, can we? No, we can't. But because of the miracles of modern medicine, you can get on YouTube and you can do a search for something like, I can't remember some of the strings, first sight, where people who've been blind since birth haven't seen any light, have a surgery, and they not only see light, they see color. There's this one, I'll probably tear up just talking about it. There's this one, I can't remember if it's a young man or a young woman, in their 20s, they're married, they have some kind of optical surgery, and I think it's a guy, and he sees his wife's face for the first, they've been married like, 8 or 10 years, for the first time. It's an outline. It's not crystal clear like your face is Artemis. And he just breaks down in tears. There's another one of an old guy. He's in his 50s or 60s. Okay? He has surgery. They take him home, or they take him home. He's had his eyes bandaged. His eyes get unbandaged. He comes out the front door. And his family's put either flowers or balloons, I can't remember which, colors. His problem was he'd only seen, all of his life, I'm partially colorblind, he'd only seen black and white his whole life. And he comes out and he's this big guy, and he's just bawling like a baby because he sees red, orange, yellow, green, blue. That's what Tolkien wants us to experience. And he says that's what fairy stories give to us. How so? Because they make us perceive reality differently. They give us experiences that aren't our own, that kind of make us step back and go, whoa. For example, one of the characters we will meet, second book, Treebeard, the Ent, who is a walking, talking tree. Now, Tolkien was your prototypical, your quintessential tree hugger. He loved trees. Absolutely adored them. Okay? And there are some pretty cool trees in Oxford. I mean, there's some absolutely magnificent trees in Oxford that you couldn't help but just go up and go, oh, okay. I'm from California. I'm, hiking, backpacking around the redwoods. Go up to a redwood, and I'm standing out here and look up in the top of the redwoods 200 feet away. And the redwood's been alive for 2,000 years. You can't be in the presence of something like that and go, what can you tell me? What can you? That's kind of what Tolkien's kind of getting at, right? Escape. Why do we need escape? And what kind of escape? Because he draws a distinction between two different kinds of escape, two radically different kinds of escape. They are, anybody know?
I think that terminology.
The flight of the deserter and the escape of the prisoner.
Yeah.
Deserter. What does it mean to be a deserter?
To abandon something that's worthwhile.
Okay? You're 90% there. It's not only something that's worthwhile, it's something you're supposed to do. It's to abandon your responsibility, to abandon your charge. We're going to see in The Lord of the Rings, the character of Eowyn agrees to accept a charge. It's not foisted on her. She is asked, will you? And she agrees to. And then 20 minutes later, she finds out Aragorn's going to go do something heroic and manly. And she's like, well, I want to go with you. If you're going to die in battle, man, I'm a shield maiden. I'm kick-ass, I want to do this. And he's like, you can't. You already accepted this. He's essentially saying you can't desert your responsibility. She takes that to mean, all you're saying is I'm a woman and I can't do this. I've got to, change diapers, et cetera, et cetera. We'll talk about that when we get to it. So, the flight of the deserter, someone who has a job to do, standing on a post and says, nope, don't want to do it. I'm going to leave. That's one kind of escape, right? Versus the escape of the prisoner. And I don't think he means prisoner, the person who is lawfully put in prison because he or she has broken a law and a judicial proceeding of some kind has said, you got to go to jail. I think because he's using the imagery of military, someone who is a prisoner of war. It used to be the policy, Second World War it was, what is your number one objective if you are captured? Escape. Escape. Return to your unit if you can. Okay? So he's drawing a distinction between those two things. And there's a film, at this point I always forget the blasted title of the film, with Cuba Gooding Jr. and Anthony Hopkins. Okay? Where Anthony Hopkins plays an anthropologist studying the gorillas in Africa, and he goes a little bit, crazy, because he strips all his clothes off and he lives and gallivants around with the gorillas for about 4 years. I mean, he becomes gorilla essentially. And then some poachers come in and start killing the mountain gorillas. And because they're killing his family, he goes crazy. And he kills one of the poachers. He gets captured because he's a United States citizen. He can't be tried in Africa. He gets sent back to Florida, where he has to stand trial. But they think he's crazy. So Cuba Gooding Jr. is the psychologist appointed to him to determine, is he really crazy or not? And if he is crazy, to help get him sane enough so that he can stand trial, so he can be properly executed. Since he'll be sane at that point. Well, there's a scene where Anthony Hopkins' character is in his prison cell at Stark, the penitentiary in Florida. Okay? And Cuba Gooding Jr. comes and visits him. And he's totally blown away when he looks inside this cell. Because the cell's got the iron bars, and he turns around and here's a wall, and here's a wall, and here's a wall. And all three walls are painted to look like jungle. And Anthony Hopkins' character essentially says, you can put me in prison, but you can't take me from Africa. That is, I might not physically be able to escape from here, but up here, you can't touch me. You can do whatever you want to my body. You can't touch me. That's Tolkien's idea about escape. Because what if you could escape from life right now, your life, what are some things you would want to escape from? I don't mean all of life. I mean, I get on Millennium Falcon, you off, whatever. What are some bad things of your life? Let's use the negative term of baggage. Society? Okay, it's too broad. How many of you right now, student loans, this class? How many of you would go, man, I'd like to get rid of this class? You don't have to answer that, okay? Student loans. Housework. President drama. What else?
My grandfather's Alzheimer's.
My dad's Alzheimer's. My mom got Alzheimer's 3 years ago. My dad has Alzheimer's pretty good now. So when we get to the scene in Harry Potter, when Harry meets Neville's mother, yeah, I might break down at that point because I see my mom when I see that. What else?
I was bedridden for 2 years, and I used a lot of literature and whatnot to sort of escape from that.
I had a former student, became my godson, who was essentially bedridden for 7 years because he had Lyme disease. And during that 7 years, it was the greatest thing for him. Taught himself ancient classical Greek and a whole bunch of other stuff. The guy's absolutely brilliant. Okay, what else? They're serious. You guys are missing some more serious things.
Bad friends.
Bad friends. Hunger. Poverty. Abuse. Spousal abuse, child abuse, sexual abuse, racism, prejudice, bigotry. Those are all big things, right? Death. Any of you actively getting in there going, man, I can't wait till I die. Just let it come. But you're not killing yourself, but you're going, oh man. Maybe you're an ardent, devout Christian going, come get me, Jesus, Or maybe you're whatever. Usually no. Most of us like, no, Jesus can wait. Hold on, Jesus, don't come yet.
Don't take the wheel just yet.
Yeah, unless I'm dying, unless I'm about to crash, then Jesus take the wheel, Okay? Most of us want to put death off as far as possible. All right? Look at Hollywood, man. It's clear most of them do. Why?
You've got some weird science.
You got some weird juju going on there with the plastic surgery, the people trying to look like 30 when they're 80. Okay? Death, Tolkien says, is the final great escape. It's the one thing that if everybody could, they would try. And we have tales of immortality and what immortality is like. And those tales are never good.
Yeah.
They're always where the person who keeps on living finally kind of goes, would somebody please kill me? Because what happens? And think about it for a moment.
Everyone you care about dies.
Bingo.
The world is constantly changing.
Well, even leave the world of conflict. You get married, you have children, you have a spouse, etc. Or maybe you don't have, whatever. And they die, and you keep going. And then you do it again, and you keep going. That would be horrible. Okay? So, death, the last final great escape, is what Tolkien calls it. Okay? And then he gets to consolation. 10:51, 14 minutes. Consolation. What does he call consolation? What does he mean by that? He uses the two-word phrase that we're all familiar with. What does every Disney fairy tale end with? The happy ending. Or three-word, the happy ever after. Wasn't there a movie, Happily Ever After? With Amy Adams and what's his name? It's a good movie, okay? Happily Ever After. The happy ending. Do all stories end with happy endings? Okay. We're going to hear Sam Gamgee midway in the third book, Return of the King. Sam Gamgee becomes armchair literary theorist, and he's going to talk about stories and what kind of stories are good stories and what kind of stories are bad stories. And he's going to do it in relation to the story that he finds himself and Frodo in. And he's going to say, well, gee, Mr. Frodo, what kind of story do you think we're in? Well, at that point in the novel, Frodo's given up. Frodo's thinking, he's kind of like, you guys are too young to remember this. In the 60s, 70s, I can't remember what it was, there was a televised or a TV cartoon version of Gulliver's Travels. And there's a character in there named Glum. And he always walked around saying, it'll never work. And that's all he did. They'll come up with, it'll never work, you know. Well, that's kind of what Frodo's like at that point in Lord of the Rings. Yeah, Sam, we'll keep going, but we're all going to die. Yeah, we might get there, but we're going to die. We're never going to get back home. Sam's like, man, suck it up, man. Be a hobbit. You can't say be a man because he's not a man. You know, be a hobbit. Okay? Well, Tolkien's idea of consolation is not the happy ending. It's not. He says it's the sudden good turn. And he creates a phrase. I'll talk about this if we have time. The catastrophe. EU catastrophe. Everybody knows what a catastrophe is, right? For some people, politically, it was November 8th, 2016. Okay? What's a catastrophe?
Something so devastatingly bad it seems impossible to go back from.
A horrible, life-changing event. But notice the term I put on before. It's a horrible, life-changing event. We tend to think that the meaning of catastrophe is something sudden but horrible. It's not literally what the word catastrophe means. Catastrophe literally just means a sudden turn, a sudden change. We collectively think it has to be bad. It doesn't. A catastrophe could be positive. It might be, Jared, winning the lottery the next time it's up at 500 million. For most people, you go, yes, that's not bad. That's good. Tell you right now, I don't play the lottery. If one of my kids bought a lottery ticket and we won 500 million, I wouldn't be here the next day. My integrity is not that high. Okay, I'd say, department chair, get a sub.
Just read the book.
Yeah, read the book. Send me your essays. I'll be at the beach that I own. A eucatastrophe is a beautiful, positive, sudden turn. We see that word, the EU prefix, in words like eulogy, euphemism. A eulogy is a good, positive word that you say over somebody who's dead. Even though that person who's dead might be a dirty, rotten SOB. You don't ever hear at funerals dislogies.
Dropping a diss track.
No. Somebody who died recently. I don't know. Who died recently? Neil Peart, okay?
The son of Tolkien.
Christopher Tolkien. Dirty, rotten SOB just wanted to make a ton of money off his dead father's writings. No, you don't do that. Even if he's really, okay, maybe Hitler, Osama bin Laden, we didn't hear many eulogies about. Okay, we did hear some, the Iranian general. Some of the media's first reports, widely respected general. And then, when the hatred came out of the woodwork, they changed it. Terrorist mastermind. When the United States killed the leader of ISIS several months ago. Widely respected, revered Islamic leader. I think that was the Washington Post or New York Times. Immediate headline. And then, after the blowback, they said, terrorist mastermind kind of a thing. Okay? So, eucatastrophe. Tolkien calls that the sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. A sudden and miraculous turn that you can't expect to happen again. Star Wars. Third film. Jedi Strikes Back. Where is it? because there is one. It's a biggie. It's towards the end.
His dad.
Father, help me! Father, he's hit me with the blue lightning. Father, help me! And Darth Vader's there. Looks at his master and looks at Luke. Looks at his master, looks at Luke. And what's he do? He picks him up and he throws him down. And after all these years, we find out he's actually not dead after all. I haven't seen the new Star Wars. I won't see it.
Ignore that part of
Yeah,
history.
ignore what I just said. Okay? He throws him down the thing. Do we really expect that to happen? No, we don't. Because earlier in the film, Luke says to Darth Vader, "There is still good in you. I can sense it." And Darth Vader says, "No, you're wrong. I'm thoroughly evil." He doesn't do that. He says, "It's too late for me." If any time someone can say it's too late for me, what do you know? It's not too late. If they can say that, it's not too late.
Especially in a film series about faith.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Lord of the Rings. For those of you who have seen the films or read the books, where's the biggie? The granddaddy of all catastrophes.
Eagles.
Is it the Eagles?
I would say it's probably Gollum.
He bites the finger off. My precious. Oops, there's the edge. And he falls. Not like in Peter Jackson's idiotic, asinine film, where Frodo then does what, get the other series, Indiana Jones does in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where he wants to get the goblet, the grail. Frodo does not reach down into the mountain, into the crevice and go, I can get it, Sam. I can get it. No, the ring is destroyed. That's the sudden and miraculous grace. Notice, who achieves the quest? Accidentally, but he's the one who fulfills it. Okay, why can't it recur again? Well, literally there, because once the ring's destroyed, it can't go, let's rewind. Get Hermione's time turner 3 times, go back. It's done, it's over with. Okay, so Tolkien says about this and why this is so important. Again, he brings in his Catholic belief system. He says it gives a glimpse of joy. What kind of joy? Ha ha, smiley face, happy joy? No. A glimpse of joy beyond the confines of the world. That is, from Tolkien's Catholic theology, it gives a glimpse of heaven. And what he means by that, what he suggests by that, is it tells us whatever is wrong, whatever is bad, whatever is evil, will not ultimately win. The bastards don't get it all. And I think one of the reasons he does that is because Tolkien's work is heavily influenced by Norse mythology, by Norse figures and characters. Okay? Gandalf, for example, is named. All the names of the dwarves in The Hobbit come from Norse mythology and such. Norse mythology, Germanic mythology, 4. Okay? Anybody know how that ends? There's 2 basic strands. The predominant strand, in terms of the arc of the story arc in Norse mythology, is evil wins. Hel, Loki, the frost giants, the dwarves, the Orkneys, things they're called, win. Humanity, the gods, the elves, the good ones that there aren't many in Norse mythology, they all lose. Chaos is victorious. Not very positive, right? That evil wins. Okay? I think Tolkien's kind of suggesting, no, there will be a glimpse of hope. In that other strand of Norse mythology, we get this idea that Baldur, the person whose death causes all that ultimately to happen, is resurrected and there is a remaking of Earth. Now, a lot of mythologists say there's enough similarities between Norse mythology, Germanic mythology, and Christianity, and because Norse mythology and Germanic mythology are not very old, it's probably the case that they are influenced by Christianity. I mean, Odin hangs on a tree for 9 days. For what? To gain wisdom. Christ didn't hang on a tree to gain wisdom. He already had it all, etc. Okay? All right, we're not going to get to fellowship, but I do want to talk about this very briefly, 2 minutes. He has this quote, Tolkien, "For creative fantasy is founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun, on a recognition of fact but not a slavery to it." What does that mean, a recognition of fact but not a slavery to it?
You understand that things are, but you don't have to be bound by that fact.
Bingo! So, for example, things are, the things we might want to escape from. Racism. Racism does exist in our world, right?
Yes.
Does it mean we have to accept it?
No.
No. And Tolkien is saying, this kind of fantasy, it acknowledges this exists, but it suggests what? It can be overcome. How do we know? Legolas, the elf from Mirkwood, and Gimli, the dwarf from the Lonely Mountain. What would they be in our world? David Duke and
Probably someone.
Jesse Jackson. David Duke and Louis Farrakhan. Pick your leaders. KKK, NAACP. Walking along hand in hand. Smiling, happy, getting along. We think can't happen. Tolkien is suggesting the oldest prejudices can be overcome. How? By finding some commonality, finding something to unite behind. We see it here with what? The destruction of the ring. We're going to see the same idea proposed in the Harry Potter stories. Dumbledore is going to tell students at the end of book 4, and he's going to say it again. Okay? If we have the shared purpose, if we have the shared goal, then all hatreds can be overcome. Where do we see it in pop culture? I'll end with this. Anybody seen the what's his last name? Black actor, big muscular guy, iRobot. Will Smith. Will Smith and Jeff Goldblum, Independence Day.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do we see? The world gets attacked, and what happens?
We all band together.
Yeah, I don't care if you're Russian. I don't care if you're Chinese or North Korean or Cuban, etc. Let's unite, let's get rid of them, and then we can go back to hating each other, Okay, we'll stop there. Yeah, or the Marvel movies. Better example.
So about that Fellowship of the Ring,